If you're a pastor or ministry leader, you need to hire people. But very often I get calls from pastors who are super excited because they just hired a director of marketing or a video producer or a donor development person who came from the secular business world. Maybe they came from Hollywood, or maybe they came from New York or some other business background. They're super excited. But within 6 months, guess what? They don't work out. It's happened over and over and over again. I'm going to tell you why today on this episode. So if you're hiring people, if you're a leader at a nonprofit or a church, you need to watch this episode because I'm going to give you some understanding of who the people are you're hiring and what background they should be coming from. Hi, I'm Phil Cooke. Thank you so much for following us on this podcast. I really do appreciate it. And again, I encourage you to hit like if you like this. If this means something to you, share it with people you know would help. And on this particular episode, it's designed for people who are hiring teams at churches or nonprofit organizations or ministries. If you know somebody in that category, please send them this, recommend this, because what I'm about to tell you is incredibly important. And if you're a pastor, if you're a ministry leader, an executive pastor, or someone else in that role, you need to listen because I'm going to share some things that are going to really maybe change your perspective about where people come from that you hire. Here's the thing. I get people that call me all the time, pastors, ministry leaders, executive pastors, who are so excited because they've just hired somebody. For instance, because I'm in the communication business, they'll often call me and say, Phil, we've just hired a video producer from Hollywood. Phil, we've just hired a filmmaker from the entertainment industry. Sometimes it's a donor development person from a Fortune 500 company. Sometimes maybe it's a marketing director from some hospital system or some business organization. Very often, they hire people from these secular backgrounds thinking, now they're going to really show us how to do it because they've done some amazing work. They're going to show us how to make this happen. But let me tell you, time and time again, I see that it doesn't work out. 5, 6 months, maybe a year in, the relationship fizzles. They haven't performed. It hasn't worked out. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you why. Because it's so frustrating and it drives me nuts. I mean, even our company, Cooke Media Group, we've been passed over to help consult and produce programs for Christian organizations a couple times when they preferred to hire somebody from Hollywood or somebody who would work for some big TV channel or somebody who would work for some big studio. But in every case, it's not worked out. In every case, it hasn't worked out. So I want to tell you why it doesn't and why. It doesn't mean that those people aren't talented. Doesn't mean they're not sincere. It doesn't mean they're not good at what they do. And some of them are my friends. But when you switch from Hollywood or business world or some medical world or some other background, you switch to the nonprofit world or a church or ministry world, things are dramatically different. I'm going to give you some reasons why, because these are things you need to write down and think about the next time you start hiring leaders for your team. Number one, the business models are dramatically different. So this person, whether it's a video producer or an executive, a donor development person, a marketing director, whoever, they've spent their whole life in an environment where selling products was the focus. Selling products, retail, service industries, those kind of things where they're selling product. And just because you ran a division at IBM or a Paramount Pictures doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to adapt to a new business model where largely we're asking for donations, where we're asking for people to give to support our efforts rather than selling stuff. Now, no question that nonprofits and churches sell stuff. They sell the pastor's messages or books. They sell other things, but the large chunk, the vast majority of what they do is donor development. It's fundraising. And that's a completely different mindset and a completely different model from retail. How you deal with customers selling retail is completely different from how you deal with customers when you're in a fundraising or donor development mode. So don't always think the business models jive. It's going to be a major switch for somebody who's been in a business background, even a high-level successful business background. I've often seen it fail because they're not used to the mindset switch to going to a donor development or giving background. The second thing is nonprofits don't have the cushy perks that businesses have. I mean, you know what? They don't have the limo. They don't fly first class. They don't have they don't have a team of secretaries. So often people come from a studio background or a business background or some other kind of a secular background, And they just assume that's the way nonprofits work, or they assume even churches work that way. And their expectations are completely different. I mean, trust me, if you're watching this and you work at a church or a ministry or a nonprofit, you know, like I do, that it's more of a struggle. We don't have a fleet of secretaries. We don't get to travel in limos. We don't get to stay at 5-star hotels and eat at 5-star restaurants. It's a different mindset and a different world. And trust me, I've known business leaders who came into a nonprofit or a ministry, and it didn't take long for them to realize, ouch, this hurts. This is not what I'm used to. And it created resentment, and it didn't work out. And so ultimately they left. So understand that those cushy perks just don't happen. I have a friend that went to work. He's a studio executive, and he went to work to run communications for a major nonprofit. And he realized he had to get his own coffee. He realized he just had one assistant. He realized that he had to put in expenses for everything he did all of a sudden. I mean, it was a really dramatic change for him. And he didn't last but about 6 months and went back. So cushy perks, they don't happen so much in churches and ministries and nonprofits. Third thing is, the nonprofit world or the ministry or church world is a calling. It's a calling, not just a bridge to get to another job. Very often in the secular world, people are used to moving from job to job or maybe accepting a lower level role as a bridge to get to someplace else. And very often I've seen executives or leaders in the secular business world who took a job at a nonprofit or a ministry at a church thinking in their mind, this is just going to be a bridge that'll get me by to another job. That's not the way it works. That's not the way it works. It's a calling. If you're working at a church or a ministry or nonprofit, it's a bigger calling than just being a temporary bridge job to get you to another secular business job out there. So be very careful. Even if it's your best friend, even if it's somebody in the church you love and respect, if they've suddenly had a problem at their job or they're suddenly leaving for some reason, don't just think, hey, we can snatch him and get him to run our outreach programs or get him to run our marketing efforts or get him to run our donor development or get him to lead our office team, be executive pastor. I mean, that's a huge education shift. Plus, he's going to be not so comfortable because he may be looking at that as a bridge to his next job, and that's just going to really damage and hurt your team. The fourth thing is, we at churches and ministries and nonprofits, we work long hours. I mean, sure, secular organizations work long hours. I get it. I've worked with advertising agencies and studios, and they put in an enormous amount of hours. But they don't, we don't have the car service to take us home at the end of the day. We don't have food coming in every few hours to feed us when we're working those long hours. We don't have craft services. And so very often the hours are a real problem. People that, just recently I worked with a ministry that hired an executive from the outside world, and he wanted to leave every day at 5 o'clock. Every day at 5 o'clock, he would leave, whether the work was done or whether it wasn't. And I'm not an advocate for overworking. I'm not an advocate for being a workaholic. But the truth is, in the nonprofit world, in the church world, in the ministry world, sometimes it doesn't end at 5 o'clock. Sometimes we're not finished. We need to do some things or come in early or work over a weekend. And this executive, because that had been his life, he went home at 5 o'clock every day. And that didn't last even a year, that relationship, before he finally left that nonprofit organization. So hours are a big issue. Number 5, sure, you did the occasional pro bono spot, for a TV commercial at your ad agency that you worked at or your business that you worked at. But you know what? In the ministry or nonprofit world, we work with micro budgets all the time. I used to be partners in an ad agency or a production house that worked with ad agencies. And I'm telling you, if I told you what some of these major companies spend on 30-second TV commercials, it would blow your mind. Churches, no. Nonprofits, no. Ministries, not a chance. So just because a person did that occasionally, did that free spot occasionally for some nonprofit cause, doesn't necessarily mean they have the mindset and the techniques and the understanding about how to do that for a living. Whereas in most ministry situations, we're running micro budgets all the time. We're trying to create more with less, and that's a mindset you get into. So it's very hard for that outside person from the secular business world to adapt to that kind of thinking. And finally, number 6, and I don't want to be ugly here, but I just want to ask, is there something you're not telling me? This comes to mind because very often I'll get a guy who, quote, came from Hollywood and he's going to be our new media director at our church in Cleveland or in Dallas or in Omaha. He came from Hollywood. Well, look, if he came from Hollywood and if he was as successful in Hollywood as you say, why would he be taking a media job at a church in Omaha? I don't want to be ugly. I'm just going to say that raises a lot of red flags and a lot of questions. Not to say it doesn't happen, particularly if it comes to somebody who decides to retire from the secular world and maybe really feels that God's calling them to spend the rest of their career in a nonprofit space or working with a church. But so often, I'll get guys that come to me with huge Hollywood credentials or huge business credentials. They work for Exxon, they work for Apple, they work for Google, and now they're coming in to run social media at your church. Hold it a second. If you were a vice president or a high-level executive at Google or Apple or some other place, why would you take such a pay cut and such a step down to run social media at a local church? Now, and I say step down structurally, not calling-wise. But the truth is, I just wonder if there's something you're not telling us. Why did you leave? Why are you not that person anymore? And very often, if you look, I just had a guy the other day tell me he came from a studio and he'd worked on a bunch of movies. Well, the truth is, when I did some investigation, he'd been a very, very low-level guy. He was not much more advanced than a runner on those movies. And yet, he was pitching himself as a studio executive to this church in the Midwest. And once we investigated, we found out what he was pitching was not really the case. So don't want to be ugly, like I say. I said that too many times, but it's true. I just think you should ask hard questions when people come in and tell you they have those kind of backgrounds. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying for-profit people can't greatly benefit a ministry. If their heart is right, if they've learned to make that adjustment, and this is where, as an executive pastor, or as a pastor, a ministry leader, you need to have that come to Jesus meeting with this person before they're hired, because the realities of working in a secular environment versus working in a ministry environment are so dramatically different. And there are a lot of red flags to think about. And here's the other thing. Before you pass on that vendor, that Christian vendor or the Christian consultant to go to somebody with great credentials from the outside world, just remember that Christian vendor or that Christian consultant may have spent decades working in situations exactly like you're facing. And they may know exactly what challenges you're facing and exactly the answers you need because they've been around it so much. So don't think twice before you pass that up just because somebody has fancy credentials that sound like, whoa, they come from big-time Hollywood or they come from big-time business or banking or some other kind of secular environment. I hope that makes sense today because it's so important. And I say it largely because I've seen so many churches and ministries have a very, very difficult time with this. They bring in somebody with such great expectations, but that person ends up either trying to dramatically change the mission of the church because they're not used to this, or they just don't fit in, or the staff isn't loyal because the staff is, bumping heads with them. And before long, 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years at the most, it just doesn't work out and they finally get frustrated and leave. But that meant that 2 years was pretty much wasted when it came to team development, when it came to developing your outreaches or your ministry or whatever it is you brought them in to do. Think twice before you hire a for-profit person for a nonprofit job. It's dramatically different. And trust me, it'll save you so much grief in the end. If you put up that legwork at the front, it'll make a difference. Remember, find us these kind of tips and other stuff at philcooke.com. It's my blog. Love that you share these podcasts. You've been incredibly gracious. And like I said earlier, if you have a pastor, a ministry leader, nonprofit leader that needs to know this, that's hiring people, get them this episode because I think it will really make a dramatic difference for them. And share it with other people. Go to my blog at philcooke.com. You'll find other stuff. You can search for things like nonprofits, ministries, churches, hiring, leadership, all kind of things. And my posts from years and years and years will come up that I think will really help you a lot in understanding what goes into making these things happen well. It's all about your career. It's all about helping you move forward. It's helping you impact the church and impacting the culture with a message God's called you to share. Thanks for tuning in.